The Battle of Berlin was one of the defining moments of the Second World War. This epic struggle saw Soviet forces march into the heart of the German capital, bringing an end to Hitler's reign of terror and marking the start of the post-war world. The Battle of Berlin was a turning point in the war, and its outcome would shape the future of Europe and the world. In this video, we'll dive into the events of the battle, explore its significance, and examine why it remains one of the most studied and discussed events in modern history. So if you're interested in learning more about the Battle of Berlin, stay tuned and let's begin. Before we get into it guys, please make sure you drop a like and subscribe as we're really trying to grow the channel. The Soviet Union had been pushing the German army back towards Berlin since the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942. By 1945, the Red Army had reached the outskirts of the city. From the Western Front, the Allies had done the same after the D-Day landings and subsequent advances through France. In February of 1945, leaders from the Allies, the United States, Great Britain and the Soviet Union met in Yalta to discuss the end of the war and the post-war world. At the conference, the Allies agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation and to defeat the remaining German forces. This meant that the race to Berlin was on. However, Germany was not going to go out without a fight. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, ordered the German army to defend Berlin at all cost. He also appointed his best general, Wilhelm Wilding, as the commander of the Berlin defence area. Berlin was the capital of Nazi Germany and was located in the heart of the country and was considered to be one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. The city was surrounded by a network of canals, lakes and forests, making it difficult for the Allies to launch a direct attack. The German army was well prepared for the defence of Berlin, with numerous fortifications, bunkers and anti-tank obstacles in place. The city was also protected by the elite Waffen-SS units, who were determined to defend the capital to the last man. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the German forces put up fierce resistance, making the Battle of Berlin one of the most bloodiest of the war. By the spring of 1945, the Allies were closing in on Berlin from all sides. The Soviet Union, with its massive army and superior firepower, was in the lead and was tasked with capturing the city. The Allies had a clear objective: to take Berlin and put an end to Hitler's rule once and for all. The strategy for the final push into Germany was to encircle the city, cut off supply lines and gradually reduce its defences. The Allies knew that the Battle of Berlin would be a long and gruelling fight, but they were determined to succeed and bring an end to the war. The battle began on April 16, 1945, when the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive to capture the city. The operation, known as Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation, was led by General Zhukov, the same general that defended Stalingrad, and involved over 1.5 million Soviet soldiers, 4,000 tanks and 7,000 aircraft. The objective was to encircle the city, thereby forcing the German forces to surrender. The initial stages of the battle saw the Soviet forces make rapid advances towards the city. The Soviets had a clear numerical advantage and were able to quickly break through the German defences. Despite fierce resistance from the German army, the Soviets managed to reach the outskirts of the city within a few days. The German army, meanwhile, was struggling to hold back the Soviet advance and was unable to mount a counterattack. Despite the rapid advances by the Soviet forces, the German army put up a stubborn resistance and fought hard to defend the city. The Waffen-SS units in particular were determined to defend the capital to the last man. The German army also had the advantage of being able to draw on the extensive network of fortifications, bunkers and anti-tank obstacles that had been built around the city. The result was a brutal and bloody battle that lasted for several weeks, with the Soviets gradually wearing down the German forces and pushing deeper and deeper into the city. One of the key turning points in the Battle of Berlin was the Soviet encirclement of the city. By April the 25th, the Soviets had successfully encircled Berlin, cutting off its supply lines and trapping the German forces inside. This was a significant turning point in the battle, as it made it much more difficult for the German army to hold out. With no reinforcements or supplies coming in, the German army was gradually worn down by the Soviet offensive. The Battle of Seelow Heights was another critical turning point in the Battle of Berlin. The Seelow Heights, located just outside of Berlin, were the last major obstacle before the city and were heavily defended by the German army. The battle for Seelow Heights was one of the largest and bloodiest of the war, and was a critical factor in determining the outcome of the battle. After several days of intense fighting, the Soviets finally succeeded in breaking through the German defences and pushing into Berlin. The fall of the Reichstag, the German Parliament building, was also a significant turning point in the battle. On May the 2nd, the Soviet army finally succeeded in capturing the building, and this was seen as a symbol of the end of the Nazi regime. The fall of the Reichstag marked the end of the battle, and the city was finally in Allied hands, but more so in Soviet hands. The victory in Berlin was a decisive moment in the war and marked the start of the post-war world. The end of the Battle of Berlin was marked by the Soviet capture of several key landmarks in the city. Over the course of several days, the Soviet army succeeded in capturing several important buildings alongside the Reichstag, including the Chancellery and the Brandenburg Gate. The capture of these landmarks marked the end of the battle and the defeat of the German forces. Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, in his bunker in Berlin. Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun, had been living in the bunker since January, as Allied forces were closing in on the city. According to accounts from those who were in the bunker with him, Hitler shot himself in the head while Braun ingested poison. The bodies were later burned by members of Hitler's personal staff to prevent their capture by the Soviets. Hitler's suicide marked the end of Nazi Germany and the beginning of the Allied occupation of the country. It also ensured that Hitler would not stand trial for the atrocities committed during World War II, including, of course, the Holocaust. The surrender of the German forces in Berlin marked the formal end of the Second World War. On May the 2nd, General Wildin, the commander of the German forces, signed the instrument of surrender, effectively ending the battle and the war. The surrender was followed by a formal military parade in which the Soviet army marched through the streets of Berlin, celebrating their victory. The aftermath of the Battle of Berlin was far-reaching and had a profound impact on the world. The fall of Berlin marked the end of war in Europe and the beginning of the post-war world. The city was occupied by the Soviet army, and the country was divided into 4 zones of occupation, each controlled by one of the Allies. The city of Berlin, located in the Soviet zone, became the centre of the Cold War and was divided into 2 separate cities, East Berlin and West Berlin. The Battle of Berlin was one of the largest and bloodiest battles of all time, and it is estimated that 100,000 people lost their lives in the battle. Its legacy lives on, as it remains as one of the most defining moments of the 20th century. The Battle of Berlin was a complex and intense struggle with many critical turning points that helped determine its outcome. From the Soviet encirclement of the city to the fall of the Reichstag, these key moments played a critical role in bringing an end to the war and shaping the future of Europe and the world. The battle was a major moment in the history of the 20th century, and its impact is still felt today. It is a reminder of the sacrifices made by the soldiers who fought in the battle, and of the devastating consequences of war. It is a testament to the resilience and determination of the human spirit, and a powerful reminder of the importance of peace and understanding between nations.